Events have a form as much as things have. Even the Greeks, those lovers of statues, were far from insensible to the essence of tragedy or of a happy life. Now the form of an event is not that event itself. An event, as I take the word, means a portion of the flux of existence. It is a conventional moment, like the birth of Christ or the Battle of Waterloo, composed of natural moments generating one another in a certain order and embedded in a particular context of other events, so that each event is a particular and can occur only once. Only the type of such a sequence, composed of such movements, is the form of the event, and this form is a universal. It need never have occurred. If I had said the resurrection of Christ instead of his birth, the reader might have his doubts about it. The fact that such an essence was exemplified somewhere in an event would be a historical truth. In order to substantiate it, the flux of matter must assume that form. Without this material and incidental illustration, that type of sequence would remain in the air, in the realm of fiction or of theory. It is especially important at this point to dispel that confusion between essences and facts which makes a quicksand of all philosophy. I will therefore give a separate name to the essence of any event, as distinguished from that event itself, and call it a trope. In what precisely does an event differ from the trope which it exemplifies? I reply, for I must be brief, in being enacted. Any substance differs from the essence of that substance, and any event from the essence of that event, in that it can arise and perish, and this in two ways: externally, by intruding into a field of irrelevant entities, or quitting that field, and then again internally, by changing the order of its parts, each of which, in a thing or an event, has an individuality internal to it, and is a concrete component, not merely a fragment or aspect of the whole. Things and events are contingent and they are compound, even if monotonous or continuously similar, whereas their essences are eternal, and even when complex are not compound but absolutely indissoluble. Now, in a flux, the total essence realized in the form of its flow during any particular period obviously cannot be realized in any one of its moments. When only this moment exists, it can be realized only progressively, by the order in which those moments arise and vanish. This order is the trope. It is the essence of that sequence seen under the form of eternity, and since existence in this event has realized that essence has descriptive value in respect to this world. It belongs to the realm of truth. For this reason, the trope is not on the same plane of being as a perspective, because it is not relative to any point of view or native to any psyche. A perspective is only specious, whilst a trope is formal. The flux of its own initiative and in its own person falls into that order composed of those elements, whether anyone observes it or not. The trope is a historical truth, the perspective is a historical impression. But these relative impressions or perspectives could never arise if substance and the flux of substance had no essence of their own to begin with. That would be tantamount to saying that substance was nothing, that there were no moments and no centers, and that there was no difference between a flux and what was not a flux. The nature of existence is to possess whatsoever nature it possesses with a treacherous emphasis, dragging that essence, by a sort of rape, from its essential context into contingent relations. Those relations, being contingent, are variable, and the flux is merely the realization of this intrinsic variability involved in existence. The flux is accordingly always tracing some path through the realm of essence, and at every point assumes an assignable posture. That is to say, while each natural moment enriches the flux with its intrinsic quality, The existence of that moment comes by a transformation of the substance which flows through it and unites it in a determinate trope with its antecedents and its consequence. Thus, in order to describe an event, we need to look forward and back along the path of change, and to note what each included moment which we are able to distinguish had for its origin and for its results. Observation then discovers a trope, but unless this trope spans all existence and extends endlessly to some absolute end of time, the total event which it defines will be like the natural moments composing it, a mere episode, and this episode, observed because we happen to belong to the same epoch, will be caught on the wing, leaving a margin before, behind, and around it of unexplored contingency. The embosoming reality, by virtue of which this whole episode takes its place in nature, will remain unknown. The mind cannot pursue the roots of things into the darkness. It cannot discover why they exist. It must be satisfied with noting their passing aspect, which is but an essence, and it must follow the chase, carried by its own galloping substance, to see what aspect they may wear next. The flux or the path of existence will elude us if we are content to express it lyrically, by eliciting the intrinsic essences of its single moments. But it may be partly described dramatically, in epic tropes, in terms which are formulae or types of sequence. Tropes are not necessarily exhaustive even of that part of the flux in which they may be discovered. Many heterogeneous tropes may run on together, or may appear only once, like a lost thought. When a man is speaking, there are tropes in his language, every word uttered being a trope, as well as all inflections and forms of syntax. But these cannot live detached in a realm of grammar. They can live only when grafted on the wholly different tropes of the nervous system, heartbeats, and circulation of the blood, and these biological tropes are again embedded in others of longer span, belonging to natural and political history. All these measures are more or less on the human scale, familiar but treacherous, because they in turn can only live if supported and filled out by minute incessant vibrations, molecular and ethereal, or by whatever else may mark the primary pulse of nature. In this complex of changes, perhaps endless tropes might be distinguished by a tireless and ingenious observer. Each animal and each philosopher picks out those which fall in with the rhythms and oppositions of his own habits and thoughts. A mile means 1,000 paces, and we measure all things by our own stride. These measures are not false on that account. On the contrary, they are true, since the tropes of human existence are natural tropes, belonging to the same flux as all the others and capable of being their measure. But they are not exclusive, nor exhaustive, nor preeminent, and superstition consists in thinking them so. A skeptic, fearing to fall into such superstition, might even complain that all tropes were merely impressionistic units, that in fact they were nothing but perspectives, and that in supposing them to be more, I and all other men, including himself when not skeptical, were dupes of our own human interests and habits. But the oversight and self-contradiction inherent in skepticism recurs here unabashed. In obeying our habits and interests we are masters, not dupes. Our habits and interests are themselves tropes that must have been established victoriously in the flux. If living creatures defined by those tropes are able to lift their heads out of it and to survey it, no matter how relatively and how partially, everything cannot be merely imputed. Imputation itself must exist actively, in centers and on occasions which are not imputed but actual. If, for instance, space, time, and matter were not characterized by definite properties and modes of being, separating them from non-entity and distinguishing them from one another, they would be simply nothing. If in the region indicated by these names, for we use them indicatively in perception and by animal faith, there is anything at all, it must possess the essence which it possesses, of which these names are partial suggestions, although of course the true essence of that substance need not at all resemble the images which, in using those names, may occupy any man's fancy. Skepticism, then, need not be turned into a dogma, into absolute relativism, sophism, or idealism, nor into a denial of substance and of truth. On the contrary, a skepticism skeptical of itself may become a method of discovery, and in challenging superficial tropes it may reveal deeper ones. And here, in the words interest and habit, I think we have a hint of a principle applicable to the criticism of tropes. No trope is exclusive, as if it could prevent the parallel, higher, lower, or intertwined development of other tropes. But some tropes are repeated. They are habitual modes of action or measures constantly maintained, and this circumstance distinguishes them from local harmonies, often the most important aesthetically, which arise only once, by an unprecedented union of circumstances. The advent of Christianity, of the Renaissance, and of the Reformation are important tropes never, we may presume, to be repeated, but birth and death are perpetual in nature, and the habits and passions of each creature, while it lives, are principles of reiteration. They involve repetitions in action, and they find and use repetitions in nature, answering to their own precision of form. Organisms are instruments of repetition, and they rely for their existence and prosperity on the repetition of opportunities for the repetition of their acts. Were this reliance not justified, or this mechanism unstable, there could be no life, experience, or art in the world. The more exactly and the more pervasively a trope repeats itself, the more it introduces itself, if we discover it, into the heart of the flux, and the better it supplies us with an instrument and a background for tracing such rarer tropes as may be discernible occasionally, or such as may arise only once. Moreover, repetition of itself marks the beginning and the end of a trope and rescues it from the arbitrary scope of human apperception. Tropes realized only once, like the whole history of the world, if there be such a total, are resultant harmonies, which only emotion could regard as reasons for their own existence. Tropes realized occasionally leave open the question of their incidence. Why do they appear at certain junctures and not at others? If no reason can be given, the flux to that extent is found to be chaotic. If, on the contrary, their initiation is regular, they are parts of a universal trope, which requires them at those junctures and connects their occasions by a mechanism deeper than they. This universal trope will be realized everywhere and contained, not interrupted, in the realization of all supervening occasional tropes. The flux can be truly and surely measured only by tropes which repeat themselves uninterruptedly on their own plane. Such a trope is called mechanical, so that to say that the world is fundamentally mechanical is the evident alternative to saying that it is fundamentally chaotic. Nor is it merely by a play on words or a sort of divination that we are justified in saying so. The thing follows from our original trust in the possibility of action, which is the criterion of existence and the test of substantiality. The agent and his world must both be compacted of matter moving in constant and recurring tropes, if the one is not to be mad and the other treacherous. Men of the world, and women even with more assurance, are quick to foresee or to divine what must be going on. Naturally, they express this insight in loose human terms, but the trust in repetition and in mechanism is there, else all penetration, all policy would be precluded. To turn this imaginative insight into science is merely a matter of attentive observation, measurement, and transcription of current metaphors into technical terms. The behavior of animals would then appear to be scanned by tropes continuous with those which scan the behavior of matter everywhere, if not identical with them. Madness and wild originality, like volcanoes and tornadoes, will be the greatest help in hastening this assimilation. because the level of mechanism is so deep and it scales so far from the human that it is better revealed in cataclysms, miracles, and diseases than in the placid course of superficial experience. All this, however, is said in general and from a transcendental point of view. It prejudges nothing as to the particular mechanism which may actually be fundamental. In any case, in calling tropes mechanical, because by hypothesis constantly repeated, we must not assume that they are mathematically necessary, or not vital, or simple, or exclusive. On the contrary, they are contingent and arbitrary, since they are forms of existence, which might just as easily have possessed any other character. They are spanned by all sorts of other tropes, including those native to the human senses and to human logic. They are radically vital, if this word means spontaneous and irreducible to any alien principle. As to their simplicity, that is perhaps only a relation to human alacrity or bewilderment in their presence, and no property of their substance or essence. Forms of flux can never be quite simple, since they must contain several terms. In existence, they are hardly separable from the tensions which realize them, which probably extend to infinity, so that to speak of simplicity is rather a sign of it in us than a serious postulate of science. There is a reason why comparatively simple tropes, called laws, are discoverable in those parts of nature, like the heavens, which we observe from a great distance, and also in those parts, like the depths of matter, which we cannot observe at all, but may imagine in terms relative to their gross aspects and motions. Distance and theory act like a sieve. They eliminate all the detail and leave only average results or total impressions, conveyed by special and highly selective media, such as light and mathematical calculation. The picture thus produced, if there be a picture at all, is a pure fiction, visual or phonetic, simple, perfectly subjective and human. But the law enunciated may be true, that is, the flux may actually pass through the series of abstract positions selected, and in its moving equilibrium may satisfy the equations expressed in the law. When tropes are called laws, there is a danger of idolatry, for although scientific philosophers often warn us that a law is merely a formula or an average or an equation probably approximately realized in a certain plane of events, yet this probability lets loose our action and expectation, and the force of expectation projects its confidence into a myth. It erects law into a metaphysical power, compelling events to obey it. This is the great idol, I will not say of science, but of the passions which science subserves. Images are as indispensable in science as they are in worship. A thorough iconoclast, who should banish all images, poetical and mathematical, no less than sensuous, would simply make a desert of the mind and destroy all science like all religion. But these necessary images are vehicles, not ultimate objects of regard. The quick mind passes through them, here to the instant fact, there to the supreme essence. I think that the reality of law can be briefly expressed in two maxims. One, that whatsoever happens anywhere happens there spontaneously, as if it had never occurred before and would never occur again. The other, that whatsoever spontaneously happens once will have spontaneously happened before and will spontaneously happen again, wherever similar elements are in the same relations. The first of these maxims proclaims the contingency, substantiality, originality of fact everywhere. It is the axiom of empiricism, when experience is understood practically and not psychologically. The second maxim proclaims the postulate of action and of reason, called the uniformity of nature. It is only a postulate which contingent, substantial, and original facts may at any point disallow, but in so far as they do so, They revert to chaos and render life and art difficult, if not impossible. The reign of law is accordingly only a modern and bombastic equivalent for the ancient naturalness of nature. Insofar as the law is more rigid than a habit, it is a human artifice of notation. Insofar as it indicates a cooperative march of events mutually generated and destroyed, it is another name for the ways of nature or of God, for the forms which existence can show to spirit. But nature, though highly favorable to spirit, since she has bred it, is not governed by her child. And even in our familiar world, the wide margin of incalculable properties by which the calculable part of nature is surrounded, what we sometimes call her secondary and tertiary qualities, proves this most curiously. For in the world of action, as spirit conceives it, spirit itself seems superfluous. And perhaps even in that calculable skeleton of primary qualities, selected because they can be measured and predicted in mathematical tropes, there may be a margin of error, for law is an essence, eternally identical, and nature is in flux, and probably never the same. Very likely all the movements of matter are more or less elastic or organic, responsive afresh to a total environment never exactly repeated, so that no single law would perfectly define all consecutive changes, even in the plane of matter, and every response would be that of a newborn organism to an unprecedented world. There would be nothing magical in this. It would merely distribute the radical contingency of existence throughout its successive phases without concentrating it in a single initial fact and initial law, but on the human scale, and for fashioning perishable human works. Such fundamental instability in nature would remain negligible. Even in a land of earthquakes, we live in houses. Belief in law when hasty is called superstition, or when more cautious, empiricism. But the principle in both cases is the same. Both take expectation for probability, and what probability can there be that an expectation arising at one point should define a law for the whole universe? Expectation is an animal attitude resting not at all on induction or probability, but on the fact that animals are wound up to do certain things and vaguely but confidently posit a world in which their readiness may become action. In superstition, as in empiricism, we yield to the vital temptation to ignore reason, and we trust to courage and to whatever idea is uppermost in the mind. Yet in a roundabout way, on the scale and in the period of that animal life, this blind courage is normally justified by the event. For how should the psyche be ready and eager for a particular employment, if in her long evolution she had not been molded to just that employment by a world which allowed and rewarded it? How should potentialities and propensities be more deeply rooted in her than in the world of which she is an integral part? Certainly her ideas are specious and her passions precipitate. Yet for all their delusions and disarray, they have brought her forward, and she survives, so that things expected, hoped for, and worked for by any prospering animal are, on the whole and with the difference, likely to happen. There is then no necessity in the relation between cause and effect, and no assurance that law is constant. Nevertheless, causation is prevalent. Were it not prevalent in fact, the expectation of it could never have arisen. But the validity of a prevalent law lies simply in its function as a measure of events. It is no adequate description of them, much less a power bringing them about. Obviously, the complete and actual march of events cannot be reduced to anything else than its full and precise self, and even its complete form, being in essence, would be, if considered apart in another realm from its manifestation. There is no constraint to exist native to these tropes, but it may be true that the flux, which must exhibit some form or other, does for a time and in certain dimension exhibit this particular trope, or, as we say, obeys this law. A mathematical or pictorial skeleton is thus traced by the economy of thought within the body of nature. leaving all other dimensions and all other tropes to hang like garlands about those calculated supports. The skeleton exists in this sense that by hypothesis this law prevails now in this region, but it is no skeleton in its operative function, like that of an animal. It is no rigid substance within the soft substance of events. It is only a trope, which the thrifty mind selects from the tangle of relations which hold those facts in the mesh of existence. The skeleton is not made arbitrarily, but in sympathy with the scale and character of the action which that thrifty mind follows in its fortunes and prophecies in its thoughts. Many a divergence among philosophers may be understood and dispelled by this consideration, that the fundamental tropes in nature, far from excluding other tropes, inevitably produce them. When things are in motion, new relations arise among them by a necessary magic, and they lend themselves to description in various logics or anatomies without interrupting their habitual flux. It is never a just objection to the reality of any trope that it may not be the exclusive trope in the movement of existence, or that there are events which it cannot properly measure. Mathematical tropes may pervade the realm of matter, supporting occasional moral and aesthetic tropes which supervene on the mathematical tropes without interrupting them. Tropes, mathematical or vital, mechanical or historical, all belong to the region of Platonic ideas. They are unitary patterns distinguishable in the movement of things, which it cannot properly measure. Mathematical tropes may pervade the realm of matter, supporting occasional moral and aesthetic tropes which supervene on the mathematical tropes without interrupting them. Tropes, mathematical or vital, mechanical or historical, all belong to the region of Platonic ideas. They are unitary patterns distinguishable in the movement of things. They are no part of the moving substance executing those patterns and overflowing them. Yet, if any mind is to perceive that flux, or to distinguish any of its phases, it cannot do so otherwise than by discerning some essence exemplified there, which limits one phase or one moment and divides it from another. Of itself, existence has no wholeness. It would not be existence if it were not scattered into moments, each its own center, reaching out towards one another in the dark, forgetting what they were and what they become, and learning what they will be only by becoming it. It is the very function of flux and of volume in the flux. It is the singular virtue of physical time and space, to make it possible that incompatible things should be equally actual and irrelevant things closely conjoined. For when anything is actual, the existence of any ulterior thing becomes to that living moment eventual and unnecessary. Whether that ulterior thing arises or fails to arise, whether somewhere else it once existed or did not exist, makes no difference here. No difference, I mean, in the instant fact, for that by subterranean processes or substantial derivation, this moment has followed upon others and will issue in others again, is, if true, an additional circumstance, curious but in principle subsidiary, for each of those other moments and every physical bond between them would still have to realize and posit itself on its own account, as this moment posits and realizes itself here. The brute fact might be enlarged, but it would necessarily remain insulated and absolute in its contingency. No moment, no event, and no world can ensure the existence or the character of anything beyond it. How then impose on all existence some trope exhibited by it here and now, and trust that trope to be universal? Why should the flux submit to reproducing this particular pattern, instead of bringing others to light. The contingency of existence is pervasive, and the stress of it may be everywhere much the same, but the forms of existence are likely to be always, as we recede from any fact, increasingly different. The repetitions are as contingent as the novelties. Each field of repetition, if we extend the range of observation beyond its limits, proves itself a novelty, as does every species of animal, every art, and every idea. Even if, in fact, some trope is perpetually recurrent, or if one little unchanging world is suspended forever in the midst of a vacuum destined never to be peopled by other worlds, still this final truth is an accident and almost a paradox. For why should this universe have become to be so trim when the infinity of essence was tempting it to be otherwise? It follows that whenever a trope of any sort has been distinguished and found to prevail in nature, as far as our knowledge extends, it need by no means prevail beyond the limit of this domesticated region, nor above or below the level of our human sensibility. It need not even exclude anomalies and outbreaks of chaos in the interstices of the prevalent tropes. In viewing any part of nature as a unit, as we do in the act of discovering a trope, we have necessarily substituted an essence for it. For this reason, essences only can be data. The fact which has aroused this intuition, and which we posit in these sensuous or grammatical terms, necessarily transcends these terms and every ideal synthesis of them. It exists on its own moving plane, by tension towards ulterior facts and by relation to them. Our intuition is a snapshot. The image it creates yields a word, a law, a logos, and another realm of being from the flux which confronts it. The tropes which we call the laws of nature cannot therefore exclude other and contrary manifestations of what nature secretly contains. Egotism and credulity may protect most of us from troubling about these foreign possibilities. If there comes any startling failure in our presumptions, any miracle or paradox, we are inclined to believe that the marvel responds to our private interests even more directly and surely than does the familiar routine of the world. And the more remote and eccentric the comet that intrudes into our skies, the clearer proof we read in it of our home faith. Everything is indeed a support for the religious spirit, and that spirit is addressed to the truth. But when it is addressed to imposing on the universe its own animal habits and animal prosperity, the farther it ranges, the more it is likely to find itself out in the cold. For fear of this unhomeliness of the infinite, some philosophers in all ages have adopted a heroic way of asserting the absolute domination of their acquired science. They have supposed that the history of the world is self-repeating and comes round forever in a circle. Infinity and familiarity are thus reconciled, and the limited evidences of human knowledge do not prevent it from claiming unlimited authority. The horrid sense of something alien and undiscoverable beyond receives its quietus. There is, the inspired philosopher asserts, always something beyond the known, but it is always a repetition of what he has discovered. It is this again and again, and so without further exploration, and without the superhuman labor of changing his habitual categories, the philosopher realizes his dream of finding the trope, vast or minute, which nature shall be condemned to exhibit forever. To assume such inertia in things, when existence is essentially inventive and spirit the most sublimated and volatile form of it, might seem to be itself a curious instance of inertia, and of inertia in the wrong place, because thought at least might be lively, but the motive and the true sphere for such a love of finality lie in the moral life. There it is indeed imperative to find a master trope, and to stick to it. The psyche, as we shall see presently, is herself a trope, not a substance, but a trope so embedded in substance as to execute itself energetically when it has a chance, and not merely to be exhibited passively. by a concourse of other tropes. The psyche is a definite potentiality rooted in a seed and exhibited unswervingly in the development of that seed, if suitably nourished and allowed to mature. Such an innate but merely potential trope, which an animal strives to realize by his growth and action, has the aspect of a will. It may become conscious, not at first or normally conscious of its own ultimate form, but rather of incidental contrast between pleasure and pain, success and failure, involved in the realization of its destiny. In hunger and the chase, in wounds and constraint, an animal gradually learns to distinguish such objects and actions as are good, and that they further the discharge of his innate powers, from such as thwart this discharge and are evil. All experience and wisdom will do nothing but define for him the trope in which his life moves or ought to move. Hence the profound marriage of animal life with reason, with definition, with selection. Hence, too, the abusive projection in human philosophy of rules of art upon the flux of existence. The realm of matter, for the moralized spirit, seems to exist only to be mastered, to be reformed, to be painted. Such is indeed its moral function in man, in so far as he profits by its economy. Profit, or the hope of it, rules the thrifty mind, not only in religion, where the edifying aspect of things is deputed to be their essence, but also in science, where the most august philosophers, in order to judge between true and false theories, often employ the childish criterion of simplicity. The flux, however, is not subject to these subjections, and only a speculative spirit, after much discipline, can learn to rejoice with it in its freedom.